What's going on, guys? My name is Wade with TechDaily. So if you clicked on this video, assuming it would be me hating on Motorola yet again, well, sorry to disappoint, that's not the case this time. I actually really like the 2024 Moto G Power. It's a great phone with decent specs for a really friendly price, especially if you snag it from a prepaid carrier. I just think that Motorola's naming scheme for this phone doesn't make much sense anymore. Years ago, the Moto G Power was a phone Motorola explicitly advertised as having 3-day battery life. Seriously. And with a 5,000 milliamp hour battery at that time, it was one of the largest capacities you could find. You can obviously see where the Power name came into play. But today, tons of phones have 5,000 milliamp hour batteries, including all the other Moto Gs in the lineup this year, like the cheap Moto G Play and the top tier Moto G Stylus, and all of Samsung's A series from the A05 up to the A55. And there's even phones with way bigger batteries now, like from Unihertz and Doogee and brands you've actually heard of, like Asus. Motorola doesn't even make a reference to the power distinction anymore. They admit this phone will now last you just over a day, depending on your specific usage, and there's not a single braggadocious tagline or marketing mention of the power in its name. So to both make things more clear and to streamline their smartphone lineup, I think it's time Motorola dropped the power in the name. Just Motorola Moto G. It's cleaner. And also abandon what currently is the 2024 Moto G, because that phone does exist, but it totally sucks. I'll save that for a separate video though. The 2024 G Power is one of those phones that you're gonna find offered from like every carrier imaginable here in the US. So while you can buy it unlocked directly from Motorola or Amazon, you probably shouldn't. I mean, yeah, it's perpetually on sale, currently $50 off, and even for $250, it's definitely a budget device by today's standards, but it's free from Straight Talk Wireless and Total Wireless. It's $200 from T-Mobile, $169 from Verizon. Walmart's got it for under $100. I mean, pick your carrier or pick your price. You have pretty much unlimited options to get this phone for cheap. One thing that's remained pretty much the same on most Moto devices the past few years is their more budgety look from the front. And it's funny because 50% of people say, why do you criticize the bezel so much? Or what's a bezel? While the other 50% say that they can't stand to look at a phone like this with such a terrible screen-to-body ratio. To each their own, I guess, but the Moto G Power's big 6.7-inch screen feels even bigger with the black borders that surround it, especially at the bottom. And its tall, elongated form factor certainly makes it a handful, but I also know that a ton of people are super happy to get such a large device for such a good price. Around back, Motorola added this new eco-friendly faux leather material to the 3 higher-end Motos, and I think it's this sort of change-up and subtle nod to both sustainability and luxury that'll catch people's attention. It's a nice build. My only real complaint is that it catches a lot of the dirt and fuzz in between the wrinkles, so it's not as easy to clean or keep nice as plastic or metal, but besides that, I'm a pretty big fan of it. The rest of the phone is that imitation aluminum that's secretly just plastic, though there's nothing particularly cheap that stands out. Motorola also refers to their phones as water repellent, though I wouldn't go snorkeling with it myself. Anything more than an accidental splash probably won't be good. The 2024 G Power ships with 128 gigabytes of storage, which unfortunately is half as much as last year, and there's no higher configuration options to opt for. But Motorola kept the microSD card slot on this phone, so if you need the extra gigs, you can buy and pop in an SD card for cheap. The headphone jack is also still here. You get a dual speaker setup too, and the power button fingerprint sensor is fast and functional. I personally prefer a physical sensor on these budget phones to the less than stellar in-display options that aren't the flagship quality myself. So with all the good of the Moto G Power, there is one thing that's still kind of bad. This phone has the same sad, dull, and dim LCD display that's plagued Moto's G series for years. The 6.7-inch panel is the right resolution, 2400 by 1080, packing in 393 pixels per inch for superior sharpness, no matter how close you want to look at things. And if you jump on into settings and bump up the display refresh rate to 120 Hz, you'll consistently see the smoother, faster visuals and more responsive taps and touches with a slight sacrifice in battery life. Unfortunately, you'll also be staring back at your own reflection a lot, because the low quality display glass is glare prone to say the least, and the phone just doesn't get very bright either. It's an LCD display, so that's sort of expected, but it's a tough compromise to make nowadays, I think, when there are plenty of phones in the sub $300 price point with OLED panels, and still have all the other display specs I mentioned. An LCD display like this also just doesn't look very colorful or vibrant. I mean, the default color profile for the display is a supposed enhanced saturated look. The natural color option looks pretty bad in my opinion, but this is a far cry from Samsung's A15, for example, which is a brighter, bolder AMOLED. The reason I think Motorola stuck with a screen like this on the Moto G Power again this year is, well, one, to keep the costs down, but two, they had to give you a reason to consider the higher tier Moto G stylus, which does offer a better, brighter OLED display this year. But at this point, I feel like Motorola should just give all their phones decent OLED displays. Especially since, like I always say, the screen is literally what you look at when you use the phone, so it should be where most of the money is. I'd rather see them sacrifice in other places, but that's just me. Motorola definitely didn't sacrifice in sound quality. I badgered them for years to put dual speaker setups on all their phones, and they've done just that. The out loud listening experience I think is pretty good, and here's a quick sound sample so you can hear it too. So as far as the specs and performance, the Moto G Power is powered by the MediaTek Dimensity 7020, a pretty powerful chipset considering its price point, but more of a sidestep compared to last year's Dimensity 930. What you do get more of is RAM, 8 GB, and that'll keep your apps current in the background and increase gaming performance quite a bit too. The G Power ships with Motorola's very polarizing Android skin over Android 14, and while I regularly complain about the ridiculous pre-installed advertising folders and other Moto bloatware apps, as many of you have pointed out, it's really no different than Samsung or any other OEM at this point, and a lot of that junk can be deleted. The biggest sticking point for me really is that what you see software-wise on this phone is basically what you can expect to have for the lifetime of you owning it. We may see this phone get Android 15, maybe, but beyond that, Motorola will abandon it, just like they do with all their cheap Moto Gs. Sure, there might be some security patches from time to time, but if you think you're going to be getting Android updates for 3 or 4 years, you're going to be disappointed. And you can take that to the bank. Feel free to prove me wrong, Motorola, anytime. But the thing about that is, a lot of folks who run through these Moto devices year after year don't really care. Considering they're so cheap, or in a lot of cases free, and since you can simply swap it out every year or two with another cheap or free Moto device, a lot of people have told me that they don't really care about the lack of software updates and don't particularly care about new features that may also appear to slow down the phone as time goes on. That's fine, but at a bare minimum, I hope Motorola continues with important security patches that may be necessary to keep these phones secure for a couple of years. That's the bare minimum in my mind. Performance-wise, this is a phone that can certainly handle anything you throw at it, but I also think that if you're buying a phone like this, you aren't going to be doing anything crazy with it. In my experience, it's been reliable for all the basic stuff, all the necessities, and even the extras like gaming if you want that. It's not clunky, it's not choppy, it's not screaming or crying using every hardware resource at its disposal to get through a task. It's a solid performing phone considering its sub $300 price tag, and I think if you have the expectation that this is not a flagship, you're going to be pleased. You're just also going to have to be a fan of Motorola's user experience, but if you've had multiple Motos in previous years, I'm sure you're used to its various quirks and features. One last thing to mention on performance, if you want to call this Moto G Power a more powerful device than the Moto G 5G and Moto G Play this year, then by all means go for it. It's a way better performing phone with better all-around specs than those two, so I suppose in a way its power distinction is more relevant here with performance than with battery life by comparison, but this might be a bit of a stretch. Like I explained at the start of this video, the Moto G Power's 5000 mAh battery isn't particularly special or long-lasting by today's standards, and there's nothing about this phone that's going to get you further for longer compared to a similarly spec'd Samsung, OnePlus, or any other Android OEM you can think of. The power is no longer with the battery, though I think most people will safely sail through a day's use without needing to be plugged in. When you do need to charge, this phone does actually support faster 30-watt wired charging. Not crazy fast, but faster than the cheaper phones, so long as you yourself buy and use the proper fast charger, since Motorola doesn't give you one. Which, if you're going to still call this phone the Power, out of all the Motos, I feel like it would make the most sense to include a fast charger in the box and advertise that, no? Interestingly enough, you also get 15-watt wireless charging on this phone, so maybe tally another half a point for that power feature. But overall, the battery and longevity is not something that's really special here with this phone anymore. Finally, one great thing Motorola did with the Moto G Power this year is consolidate the camera setup to two useful lenses. Around back, you now get a familiar 50-megapixel main shooter and a much appreciated 8-megapixel ultra-wide. No useless depth sensor, all the portrait stuff is software-based anyway, and for you macrophiles, don't worry, there's still an up-close picture-taker mode, just without the unnecessary hardware. The selfie camera seems unchanged from last year, and inside the camera app, you'll be hard-pressed to find, well, anything else that differentiates this Moto camera setup from last year's or any other Moto phone for that matter. The ultra-wide lens is a great add. I think far more people will get more use out of that than probably anything else. And the regular pictures and videos you capture with this phone, well, they look like they were taken on a Moto device for sure. They're a little funky with their processing and color balance, over-processed but somehow often blurry and oversaturated to the point where I often look like an orange, but I don't think anyone is buying this phone in particular specifically for its camera features. You can get a Pixel or an iPhone or even an upper tier A series phone for that. This phone's camera setup is certainly more useful and streamlined, but well short of anything pro photographers or even Instagram influencers would care for. And I think that's just been the case on these Moto G devices for a few years now. To me, the 2024 Moto G Power is now sort of the regular Moto G, with enough features and specs where you don't feel like you got a cheap prepaid device that barely works, but you didn't spend hundreds and hundreds of dollars for gimmicks and things you don't actually use. Do I wish the screen was better? Yes, absolutely. But that's the only improvement this phone needs. Everything else I think is perfectly fine for free, which isn't a jab or a joke, it's just a matter of fact for this device. Cheap or free prepaid phones are often plagued by poor specs, an ugly design, and even a lack of basic features. But not this one, not the Moto G Power. It has everything a person could possibly want on a reasonably priced smartphone from a big brand like Motorola, and I'm happy they delivered a decent phone deserving of my recommendation this time around. But what do you guys think of the 2024 Moto G Power? Is this a phone you're considering right now? Do you have one yourself? Let me know in the comments down below. I'd love to hear your thoughts, of course. Hopefully you guys did enjoy this video though. Be sure to follow TechDaily on Twitter and subscribe to the TechDaily YouTube channel if you haven't already, and I'll see you guys later.